Their talk is about China, 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 China. But China is not an enemy of Africa. We have never been colonized by China. There's no single African country that was a colony of China. China at that time did not have the capacity, but China said there's no way, they have to do it. They mobilized both the human capital, the materials that were needed, the finances that were needed. It was a very difficult task. China did not have that type of rail infrastructure in its own country. But the Chinese people were ready to build that for us.
So this was not, the current China, which is the largest economy in the world, building a railway. This was China it was the 70s or early 60s. It's an entirely different proposition, it's an entirely different context.
大家好，今天要分享的是两位非洲政治家一段饱含深情的谈话。在这场谈话里，你听到的不是专家在分析地缘政治，而是两个受过欺凌的兄弟在回忆起另一个兄弟当年如何砸锅卖铁救自己于水火，并对比那些曾经欺负自己现在又带着枪回来的人时所发出的最真实、最痛快淋漓的倾诉。当听到他们强调说坦赞铁路不是现在的已经是全球最大经济体的中国建的，而是60、70年代一穷二白的中国建的，那时候中国自己都没有那样的铁路基础设施，许多非洲国家的人均 GDP 都比中国高，所以其背景完全不同，意义也完全不同。听到这里时，说实话很感动。在这个时刻才最真切地感受到中国老一辈革命家领导人高瞻远瞩的国际视野和伟大的国际主义精神。我们来听听他们是怎么说的。
If one of your opponents who has a history of overthrowing your governments, who has a history of exploiting your natural resources unfairly, if that person suddenly put established military capacity in the middle of your country, how would you feel? We see it as the beginnings, in fact, the very advanced beginnings of an effort to recolonize Africa. We think that the West recognizes that Africa is increasingly moving out of their control, and they're trying to reverse that. They recognize that now, for example, there's China in terms of trading relations, in terms of financing, in terms of infrastructure support. Africa has alternatives. And I think they're worried about that. So we see the military intensification of militarization in two ways. One, fundamentally suppress our own people. The bases are directed at us to prevent insurrection, prevent rebellion, prevent the overthrow of unpopular leaders, but they're also planned and actually articulated as an effort to exclude strategic competitors.
Well, the Americans have not hidden the reasons for those bases. They have made it very clear is to protect American interests in Africa. What are the American interests in Africa? The American interest in Africa is not to protect the African people. That's not an American interest. One discernible American interest in Africa is minerals, to protect their access to strategic minerals. Today, DRC holds about 70% of the world's cobalt deposits. Zambia, which is a neighbor to DRC, also has got huge deposits. Niger holds 70% of the world's uranium deposits. DRC has uranium, Zambia has uranium, Namibia has uranium. These are strategic minerals. These are what the Americans are protecting. Protecting from who? From us, the Africans, the owners of these minerals? Certainly not. They are trying to protect, to monopolize these minerals, these strategic minerals. Protect, keep away primarily China. Their talk is about China, 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 China. But China is not an enemy of Africa. We have never been colonized by China. There's no single African country that was a colony of China. Even today, China has never colonized and is not intending to colonize an African country. China has never shown any imperial interest in Africa. China was there with us. In our liberation struggles, China supported us. When the West was colonizing us, China was helping to liberate us. China was there to defend our independence, economically and otherwise. For instance, my country, Zambia, it was blockaded. All our neighboring countries were still under colonialism. We had no access to the ports from Mozambique, from South Africa, from Namibia, from Angola. But there was no proper road, there was no rail. We asked the Americans, the British, to help us put up a rail system to the port of Dar es Salaam. They refused. President Nyerere of Tanzania came on behalf of Zambia and Tanzania to ask the leadership of China under Chairman Mao, Zhou Enlai, for help to build a rail. China at that time did not have the capacity, but China said there's no way, they have to do it. They mobilized both the human capital, the materials that were needed, the finances that were needed. It was a very difficult task. China did not have that type of rail infrastructure in its own country, but the Chinese people were ready to build that for us. And in the process, China lost 70 of its own citizens, of its own people, in the construction of that rail. The remains of those 70 Chinese people still lie in Zambia. We have 70 Chinese people buried in Zambia today. We have Chinese solidarity that will never be forgotten, that will last forever. At that time, China did not have a single mine in Africa. They did not have a single corporation operating in Africa. Not a single one. So it was selfless, noble assistance to fellow brothers and sisters. China has continued even now when it's doing well to cooperate with Africa. If you go to Africa today, you see a big hospital. 99.99% probabilities that it has been built by China. If you see a big airport today that is new in Africa, it's a very high probability that it has been built by China. If you see a rail network that is new, know that it has been built by China. You see a big bridge that is new, it has been built by China. China is there for us. Yes, there are challenges here and there, and the Chinese authorities are dealing with those challenges. And in the first place, let's not forget that our own colonization was done with military, with force, brutal force. It was maintained with brutal force. It is being continued today in a new way again with the militarization of the African continent. Whenever there is resistance to their mining interests, they have not hesitated to use the military. So part of the militarization that we are seeing of the on the African continent, one is to protect their minerals and to ensure that they enjoy the exploitation of these minerals at the exclusion of China and the others who are progressive.
And, I think that the story of the Tanzania-Zambian Railway is a very, very important one. I always get excited when I hear you talking about this, because there's a way in which I think probably younger Chinese see that as just China's investment, China's support to Africa, in the way that they see Chinese companies active in Africa today, without the context that you provided, that at that point in time, many African countries had a higher GDP per capita than China did. That it was a massive sacrifice on the part of China. It was solidarity. China didn't set up a military base as the condition for building the railway. China hasn't established any military bases around Africa. So I think that younger Chinese people may not yet have contextualized the Tanzania-Zambia railway properly. But this was not, the current China, which is the largest economy in the world, building a railway. This was China it was the 70s or early 60s. It's an entirely different proposition. It's an entirely different context. I mean, the contrast you see, for example, the militarization, if you look in the Sahel region, in Niger, the largest drone airbase in the world is in Niger. And you mentioned the uranium mine in Niger. Now that mine alone accounts for 1/3 of France's electricity. It's one of the poorest places on earth. And they're sitting on one of the most valuable resources in the world. And next to it, you have this huge American drone base. So it is impossible for people in that area to rebel against the conditions. They're doing open pit uranium mining. The people in that area are poisoned for generations. There's a strategic resource there to protect it from Africans and also to exclude competitors like China and so on. So I really get excited when you tell that Tanzam story. It's something people need to know.
In life, it's always very important to be clear about things. And to be clear about things, sometimes it's better to understand the history. The history of things, the history of events. They are militarizing Africa today when we are not asking them to come and help us militarily. When we wanted their military assistance, they denied us. In the late 70s, mid-70s to late 70s, when Zambia was being bombarded by the apartheid regimes in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and South Africa, we had no air defenses to protect ourselves and to protect the National Liberation Forces bases. We asked the Americans to sell us air defense systems, not to grant us, but to sell us. They refused. The British also refused, including the Soviet Union, refused. The only country that came to our aid at that time was China. China gave us MiG-21s and a few tanks. And that equipment is still there today. And China did not have much at that time, but they sacrificed an entire squadron of MiG-21s and gave us.
And again, it's the same thing in Ghana. I mean, we weren't actually bombed and so on. But if you read the correspondence between the British colonial officers who then became Foreign Service officers, you read their correspondence, the person in Ghana, the person in Kenya, the person in the Home Office in London. Now, if such a person comes back and says he's building a military base, you cannot possibly think that it is in your interest.
Definitely, it's not our bases, it's their bases. And they are honest about it.
And to exclude strategic competitors.
Yes.
Yes.
Because they are not protecting us from China. China was our protector.
Yeah.
It's not only on the military front that they want to counter China. When China started the Belt and Road Initiative and infrastructure projects were started in Africa, roads, rail, and so on, they decided in their own words to counter China's infrastructure programs by setting up their own. That's the Europeans and the Americans. They have come up with a program of $600 billion over a period of 5 years to build infrastructure in Africa to counter China's influence. So there is nothing noble about what they wanted to do in Africa. There is nothing about Africa that they want to do in Africa. It's purely in their own interests. selfish interests. But we know that projects like that are not based on noble and selfless sentiments, are worthless. Likewise, noble programs, noble projects that are not based or inspired by fair and correct ideas are also worthless. It's not the first time they are promising Africa this and the poor world. A few years ago, they had promised to take 3% of their GDPs to the development of the poor world. How many of them have even contributed 5% of their GDP? Near to zero. None. So we'll be very happy if this 600 billion they have promised for Africa infrastructure and investment actually materializes. And they are saying it's going to come from private and public sources. That in itself is problematic. It's problematic. It cannot be guaranteed. How can they guarantee what private investment will be? How can they guarantee? On what terms are they going to bring it in? We know private investment follows profit. So how is it going to match the Belt and Road Initiative projects? Again, everything for them is in their own interest, in their interest to counter China's influence in Africa. But what is China's influence in Africa? We have a relationship with China that will be very, very difficult to break. A friend in need is a friend indeed, they say.
患难见真情，这句中国老话在非洲政治家的口中说出来，格外具有分量。中非友谊的牢不可破，并非源于空洞的宣传，而是由坦赞铁路下的英魂、赞比亚博物馆中陈列的米格21战机，以及遍布非洲大陆的中国援建项目一砖一瓦的垒砌而成。这是一条历经时间淬炼、经受危机考验的情感纽带。正如非洲朋友所言，中国在非洲没有一座矿山，没有一家公司的时候，能给予非洲兄弟姐妹一般无私的高尚的援助。现在中国发展得很好了，他们也同样信任中国，相信中国的一带一路是真心实意的帮助非洲实现共同发展与繁荣。因为中国从未也不打算殖民任何一个非洲国家，中国对非洲从来就不抱有帝国主义野心。而反观西方，面对中国通过一带一路倡议在非洲赢得的影响力，他们不仅不反思，反而张嘴就来，搞承诺竞赛。谈话中提及的5年投资6000亿美元的基础设施计划，最初是2018年时任美国国家安全顾问博尔顿提出来的繁荣非洲倡议，其本质就是一个为了对抗中国在非洲的影响力而提出的美国新非洲战略。博尔顿污蔑中国的一带一路倡议，称其为掠夺性行为，让非洲国家陷入债务陷阱。他说要整合美国政府和私营企业的资源，让美国对非洲的投资和贸易增加1倍。说美国对非洲的投资要比中国阳光慷慨得多。后来发现根本无力推动这一倡议，就把它推给G7集团，与更广泛的西方投资捆绑在一起进行宣传，并开始将中国提出的6000亿美元作为一个对标和竞争的目标。时至今日，效果如何？不说也知道，口号还是那句口号，没有任何约束力的空洞的承诺和意向声明，怎么可能和中国的一带一路倡议相提并论呢？所以西方是用枪炮和基地来保护自己的利益，而中国是用铁路和医院来建设共同的未来。非洲人民的眼睛是雪亮的，谁是真朋友，谁心里只惦记着自己的矿产，他们心里有本清清楚楚的账。